So Lyman Stone and I, again, in the Atlantic, wrote a piece on kind of the decline in happiness among young adults. And we attribute that in part to less religion, in part to less marriage, and in part also to less sex. And, you know, if you had told me like even 5 years ago that I'd be worrying about young adults not having sex, I would have laughed you out of the room. But we are seeing kind of like this amazing pattern, both in the US, of course, and even more so in Eastern Asia and Japan, for instance, and South Korea, for instance, where for a variety of reasons, young adults are not having sex. I think it's sort of, it's partly a reflection of the fact that people are spending just much more time on screens and less time in person, you know, socializing, less time in person dating, and less time in person, of course, being married. And so all these factors have kind of combined. But, you know, again, we are social animals. And so things like being involved in a religious community, you know, being married, being in a relationship, you know, having sex, these things are all, you know, linked to young adults being more likely to flourish. And that in-person socializing on a variety of different levels and ways is less common today than it would have been 10 or 20 years ago.
What does it say about the sexual liberation movement of the 1960s that we've now got to a point where people are having not more sex, but less sex?
Yeah, that's the big irony, right? That we're celebrating, if you will, the sort of 50, you know, well, sort of now it's sort of the 54th anniversary in a sense of the sexual revolution. And we're seeing, you know, a dramatic decline in sex. It's quite striking. I think in part what's happening here is that when you kind of take out all the norms around sort of sex and dating and courtship, it becomes more difficult for some young adults to navigate that, both kind of in terms of dating and marriage and also in terms of sex. But I think it's also the case that the sort of the new technologies that we're using, especially smartphones, are, you know, leading to a dramatic decline in in-person socializing, and that's one of the factors in play as well.
Your research, I was quite struck by what appeared to me to be the moderate importance of religion to people feeling satisfied with their lives, the moderate importance of a couple of other factors, but the very high importance of having sex.
Right.
And here's the irony.
Right.
It's the married,
Folks
younger people married who are having the most sex.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
And that's playing into their happiness.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's, you know, it's one finding. I don't want to make a mountain out of, you know, one particular study that we did, but it is striking that sex was a big factor in the story. You know, so yes, I think, again, the irony is that none of us, I think, would have predicted, you know, again, 5 or 10 years ago that we'd be sort of beginning to worry about the decline of sex among young adults. But here we are.
Life's a strange beast. It's not quite what it looks to be on the surface.
Sure, yeah.
Another issue, I'm amazed at how often I hear women saying this. When it comes to marriage, understandably, a girl wants to find a good man.
Sure, right.
And then you hear them say, but where are all the good men?
Right.
There may in fact be sound reasons, I think, for them asking that question. Right. Research suggests that a lot of young men really are struggling to find their feet in an age when the job market's changing. It's starting to, I'm going to be very careful here, but it is, the emerging jobs are starting to provide real opportunities, more real opportunities, put it that way, for women. Boys are not doing as well at school. They seem to be suffering more with family breakdown, if I can put it that way. More of them are going to jail.
Sure. So yeah, I think
there's something to this idea that there is a shortage of good men.
We do see at my own university about 56% of the students now are female, and about 44% are male. And we're seeing, you know, across the country, women dominating kind of academic, you know, achievement kind of contests in their middle schools, high schools, and being much more likely to both matriculate and graduate from college and graduate programs. And we are seeing a growing number of young men who are not in the labor force in the US as well. So there are a lot of, you know, young men who are floundering. And of course, Jordan Peterson's success is an example. I think part of there's a lot of young men are kind of looking around for, models, ideas, and Peterson had some really powerful things to say to young men. So, but in terms of what's driving this, I think part of the story is we don't offer a constructive model of masculinity to our teenage guys and young men.
Well, they hardly need to go out and slay dragons to look after their women folk and their children anymore.
That's part of it, but I'm just sort of saying, like, there's the pop culture, the schools don't really offer much in the way of a constructive model of how one could be a dragon slayer of sorts in the 21st century. We also know that young men who are growing up without their fathers are more likely to be struggling in school and in work and with the police, which is part of the story here as well. And then I think there's also a way in which the new economy often makes guys, particularly guys who are not in the college track, feel like they don't have a good future economically, a good future professionally. So these are some of the factors that are, I think, making it more difficult for, boys and young men to flourish. I guess I also would add, too, just the way in which our schools tend to prioritize a more kind of feminine style of schooling. They don't tend to give, I think, boys enough time for, recess, being out, outside. They tend to kind of minimize risky activities at school, at least in the U.S. context, and tend to kind of promote activities and forms of learning, forms of pedagogy that are often more suited, I think, to young women than to young men. So all of these things, I think, have created a context where we're less boy-friendly, less male-friendly than we used to be. And what people don't always realize is that means that there are fewer men who are kind of marriageable, because they haven't gotten the training in school, they don't have the opportunities in the workforce that would make them attractive candidates for marriage. And so I see it at my own institution at the University of Virginia, a lot of young women coming into my office and expressing concern about the lack of available men that they could sort of date and imagine a future with. And that's sort of one way in which I think this failure to sort of serve the needs of boys and men ends up actually hurting women as well.
This is interesting, isn't it? Because in one way, the first thought that comes to my mind is the idea that if what you've got here is a situation where it's terrific the girls are doing well,
sure,
but if the boys are not doing well, that's bad for the boys. But there's a whole lot of girls out there too who are finding it hard to find the right person to share their lives with.
Yeah, so exactly, yeah.
If one sex is not doing well, neither sex is reaching their optimal sort of level of happiness and contentment and meaning.
Because again, we're social animals, to use Aristotle's term, and because we're social animals, if women can't find young men or men to date and to marry and to form a life with, that's going to make them, on average, a lot less happy. It's going to deprive them of opportunities to find a unique form of meaning in life as a wife and mother. It's going to be implicated probably too in lower levels of childbearing and family formation. So there are a whole bunch of ways in which what happens to men ends up having a pretty big impact on women and families more generally as well.